Welcome to this Policies at Work panel on AI, technology, and the role of regulation. Policies at Work is a series offered this fall by the Wharton School that explores how policies intersect with the lives of everyday Americans. Wharton faculty members will analyze current US policies at the nexus of business to offer insights on recent outcomes and opportunities for improvement. In today's event, we will address AI, technology, and the role of regulation. We welcome audiences both on our Wharton campus in Philadelphia and online via LinkedIn. My name is Stefano Puntoni. I'm a professor of marketing here at the Wharton School and the co-director of AI at Wharton. With me today, we have two wonderful panelists. The first one is Kartik Hosanagar, the John C. Hauer Professor of Operations, Information, and Decisions, also the co-director of AI at Wharton, and he serves on the Responsible AI Council for the US Department of Defense. And I've done a lot of work with Kartik, and I'm very excited about having him speak on this topic. He knows a lot about it. The second panelist is Kevin Werbach, and Kevin is a Liem, Sioe, Liong First Pacific Company Professor of Legal Studies and Business Ethics. He's also the chairperson of our Legal Studies and Business Ethics Department and a leading expert on technology regulation. Now, before we start, just some housekeeping notes. The conversation will begin with Kartik and Kevin, will follow with a Q&A with the audience. Virtual attendees should use the comment sections to submit your questions, and in-person attendees, you can use your QR code to submit your questions via poll everywhere. Okay, I hope we have a great discussion here. I'm looking forward to all your questions, so please keep them ready, and let's start it. Let's start. Okay, the first question that I have is for both Kartik and Kevin, and it is about issues that you see right now with AI and regulation. In particular, what are some of the major issues or concerns that policymakers or regulators you think are seeing right now? Kartik, why don't you start, and then we go to Kevin.
Yeah, so I feel there's no dearth of concerns for regulators to worry about. So we talk about AI and its impact on jobs, but at least regulators will be busy, I guess. In terms of the issues, there's so many of them. To name a few, one of the issues when you use AI for things like hiring or lending, you have biases as one concern, and related to biases, you have transparency of the AI-based decision-making. You've got data privacy issues. You have economic considerations such as market power concentration and impact on jobs. You have security issues, misinformation, to name a few, and I'm sure maybe Kevin has other issues that he spends time thinking about.
That is quite a catalog, and I'm sure in this conversation we'll explore some of this in a little more detail. Kevin?
Yeah, I would put it into three buckets, really. There's a category of AI safety, which is about particularly the worries of the most advanced AI models, especially these foundation models for generative AI, that they could cause catastrophic harms. At the extreme, potentially, at some point becoming super intelligent and being a threat to humanity. But even if you're not concerned about that, which I'm not particularly focused on, there are certainly possibilities we could see mass casualties, attacks on critical infrastructure, really severe harms. So that's one bucket that's about AI safety, but it's limited only to a small subset of AI systems and models. Then there are the issues, most of which Kartik talked about, which I would put under the bucket of AI governance. Accuracy, bias, privacy, intellectual property, transparency. And these are really concerns about all AI systems where they might fall short of the mark and cause potential harms. And then there's a category that I think of really as abuses, where people will deliberately misuse the AI system, not necessarily in these catastrophic ways, but things like misinformation, deepfakes, cybersecurity abuses, where it's not at all the intent of the companies developing and deploying the system, but we have these potentially significant harms that are happening.
Yeah, right. And so I think the span of the problem that you highlight is just, I think, a good way of highlighting what a challenge for regulators this might be, given how many different pieces and how many puzzles here. Now, if we are trying to be a bit more specific about this risk, I'm just curious to get your opinion on this, and I'd love to have you both reflect on this. If you had to pick the AI application that is in most urgent need of rules and regulation right now, what do you think would be?
there are a couple that I tend to think about, and they're in different spaces. But the one issue that a lot of us, will have to deal with is around deepfakes. And deepfakes is an issue that has tentacles that go into many different settings. You have an issue about deepfakes can create civil unrest, and democracies should be worried about it. Deepfakes can contribute to cyber crimes, and we've already seen financial fraud being committed using audio and video deepfakes. You have deepfake pornography. So you have many issues around deepfakes. So I think that's a very critical issue. And the other one is more around national security and AI, which is AI in the hands of the wrong actors. Could they launch large-scale attacks with drones, or in the future with hacking cyber, autonomous vehicles and things like that. So those are the kinds of issues, one around national security and the other around, more citizens.
Thanks, Kartik.
Okay, you asked for one and Kartik gave you two. So I'm going to give you two answers as well. And you were asking really, Stefano, about where there's the greatest need for regulation. So I'm not just going to talk about what I think is the biggest issue, but where there's the biggest gaps, I think, that we don't have any structure that's addressing serious problems. The first one is actually something that Stefano, you're very familiar with as a behavioral scientist studying AI, which are companion applications. Generative AI, generally systems that interact with people, sometimes just for friendship, sometimes for romantic reasons, sometimes for mental health. And these can be incredibly valuable and useful, but also potentially dangerous. And we're now running this kind of totally uncontrolled experiment. Millions of people are interacting with these systems, and in some cases spending huge amounts of time, feeling very deep connections to them. And it's not even just specialized systems like character.ai. People are doing this just with ChatGPT and general purpose large language models. And we don't really know what the effects are. We do know there have been tragic cases where people who are active users of these systems have, in some cases, even committed suicide. And we don't have any kind of structure around them. I'm not saying that we need detailed regulation, that you can't launch something unless you go through all the kind of vetting you would need for an actual mental health system that's done in medicine. But we need some way of thinking about what are appropriate guardrails and what is it appropriate for companies to do to address potentially some of those harms. So that's one. The other one that I think is a huge blank space is biometrics, in particular facial recognition. And this has been around for a long time, incredibly valuable and useful technology for all sorts of things. For identification, we all now get our face scan when we go to the airport, as well as for things like identifying criminals, for private businesses to identify shoplifters. The problem is we have lots and lots of evidence that these biometric systems can be highly inaccurate and highly biased. Lots of studies showing that they can have worse results against darker skinned people, for example. And these are well-known problems, and I mean, Kartik can probably talk to it. There's lots of technical responses to those problems. But again, we don't have a good regulatory structure. We have one law in Illinois which actually provides a private right of action for privacy abuses with facial recognition, but doesn't really deal with these other problems. So, for example, last year, and then I'll end, and I'm going on a while, the Federal Trade Commission brought a case against Rite Aid, the drugstore. They were deploying facial recognition to prevent shoplifting. Okay, legitimate, useful application, but they were basically incredibly careless. It was highly inaccurate. Lots and lots of people were false positives. They were not shoplifters, and they were pulled aside and said, you are stealing from us. And not shockingly, a very disproportionate percentage of those were Black people because of the bias in the system. And again, it's not that this couldn't be addressed, it wasn't addressed. And so I think that's a big area where we just have a gap. It's not that we couldn't think of a regulation, it's that we really don't have anything we're doing today.
Yeah, thank you both. And the context of companion AI apps, I think it's a great one to illustrate the difficulties in this area. We've done quite a lot of work in that space ourselves. And basically, what we find is that it can be a part of the solution, but also very much a part of the problem. So I think the positives and negatives are going, and finding the right balance in regulation where you're going to, address the concerns while also not stifling innovation is going to be kind of tricky, and we don't necessarily have a lot of experience with interactive technology of this kind. Like you said, people really get into a very deep relationship with this technology in a way that maybe no previous technology has done. Now, just a reminder for the audience here in the room, but also at home, to keep making those questions. We'll be coming back to your questions in just a few minutes. Now, let me direct the next question to Kartik. Now, here I think it's quite just directly building on what I was saying before. How do you think that regulators should approach AI policy to make sure that they can balance legitimate concerns about equity, welfare, and safety with concerns about stifling innovation? And are there companies out there that you think are balancing those concerns well right now?
Yeah, I guess as we were already discussing, the issues are real. The regulation is needed at some level. I think the risk is if you over-regulate, then, as you mentioned, you stifle innovation. And more importantly, for those states or countries that are regulating heavily, you'll see the center of innovation shifts away from them. So as I think about what regulation needs to look like, I think of two, approaches that make sense to me. The first is that I'm wary of broad-based regulation that cover AI in general. Because if you cast the net too wide, then you'll cover the issue you want to cover, but you'll cover hundreds of other use cases that are harmless that you will now subject to heavy compliance headaches. So I think the issues, AI regulation should be issue specific. For example, AI regulation focused on, let's say, deepfake in financial fraud, or AI regulation focused on deepfake pornography and so on, versus AI art creation or things like that. I think anything that is broad-based, and there is scope for them, should be pretty light touch, in my opinion. The second principle that I kind of feel is needed is to create regulatory sandboxes for innovation when you regulate AI. So, for example, the Monetary Authority of Singapore has a regulatory sandbox for financial use cases of AI. And so a company can do things like AI use in credit screening or credit scoring, which is heavily regulated. But you can do it in the sandbox. And in the sandbox, you have to disclose that you do it. The sandbox has limitations in terms of how many people are covered, how long you can deploy it. But what it does, it allows companies to try the innovation, get the data. It allows regulators to get the data. Dubai has a sandbox for blockchain. So I think sandbox environments for AI testing is a good idea, in my opinion.
And I like this perspective you're bringing and say, how do we facilitate learning, both on the side of the companies, but also on the side of the regulators? And I think this idea of limited, kind of like a bound experimentation within a understood frame, I think it seems to be a smart way of, because nobody has the answers exactly how things are going to pan out. As the technology is still changing very rapidly, so it's not like it's an end point and now we know what we have. Okay, thank you. And let's look now at how countries and let's say the political discourse around AI. So Kevin, this is a question for you. How would you describe the approach to AI regulation in different countries or maybe different regions in the world? And just maybe particularly zooming into the US and the news from the election, what do you think that the recent election of Donald Trump to the presidency means for AI regulation here?
Okay, how much time do we have? There's about 200 countries in the world, and I've got a whole lot to say about the election. But let me try and be focused. It's a very good question. Kartik is absolutely right that it doesn't make sense to regulate AI as such, partly because if you actually try and define what AI is, it becomes fiendishly difficult to write a specific definition that does not apply to basically Excel macros and a whole lot of other things that we don't think of as AI. No country in the world is really seriously trying to regulate all AI. They're focused on use cases or they're focused on risk. So what's going on in the world? In the US, people think there's no AI regulation. I think that's a misnomer. It's true, there is no federal AI law in the US, but there's a lot of law that exists. I mentioned before the FTC action against Rite Aid. That was not under an AI law, that was under their existing authority about unfair and deceptive practices. So one thing that's happening in the US is actually a good deal of enforcement, actually more than many other countries in the world, under existing laws. If you are using AI in hiring and it is discriminatory, you are subject to the same kinds of enforcement actions that you would be if you're using anything else that's discriminatory. So that's one piece. The other piece that's happening in the US, you might call a kind of soft law approach. The Biden administration about a year ago issued a major executive order, which predominantly is about the government. It's not binding the private sector, except for a little bit on AI safety, which I mentioned before. But it puts into place detailed requirements to address exactly that issue that you mentioned, Stefano, learning, getting the agencies of the federal government to understand better what the issues are, to have procedures in place, to do investigations, to understand these issues, with the idea that that will also have an indirect effect, because the US government is the biggest purchaser of everything, including AI technologies, so it will impact the private sector. So that's been the general approach in the US, along with a whole lot of standards work, industry work to coordinate in the shadow of government regulation, but deferring to the experts to try to figure out what the best practices are and pushing them through things like voluntary commitments to do that. I'll come back to what might be changing under Trump in a second, but just to say a little bit about the rest of the world. Two major regions or jurisdictions that I think are worth focusing on. There's a lot of interesting thing happening in other places. Kartik mentioned Singapore. The UK is also interesting, and their view has also shifted after the recent election. But I want to just briefly talk about the European Union and China. The European Union has a very different approach than the US. It has the same kind of approach that it has taken with tech regulation and privacy in general, which is comprehensive, top-down, detailed prescriptive regulation. They've adopted something called the AI Act, was passed in early 2024, that has a whole series of obligations. Now, it's a risk-based approach, so it's not all AI has obligations. It focuses on, is this so-called a high-risk use of AI? Things like hiring, defense, criminal justice, finance, education. If it's a high-risk use of AI, there's a whole laundry list of things you have to do. And then there are other categories that are not as high risk, where there's some limited requirements or no requirements at all. They claim that most AI uses will be not subject to any new requirements, but the ones that are in these high-risk buckets, and sort of an open question what buckets you're in, are subject to very detailed prescriptive regulation. Now, the devil's in the details. So they have this AI Act that's been passed, but no one really knows what it means. As these general terms, they are going through a process of standardization and engagement. So on the ground, it actually doesn't necessarily look all that different from what's happening in the US, even though the notion is they are having these detailed prescriptive rules. Third place is China. And China is certainly a place that people in the US think about a lot with AI as a competitor, as a threat. In terms of what China is doing with AI geopolitically. But China is also regulating AI domestically, because China is concerned about all these same sorts of things. China is an authoritarian state, but they are very concerned about stability. They do not want people protesting and rebelling because, for example, someone has abused their private information or someone has cheated them using this technology. So they've adopted at least 3 enforceable laws already on AI, but they're focused. One is about recommender systems, one is about deepfakes, and one is about generative AI systems. They're very focused on information control, as we might expect with China, but they're also very focused on threshold licensing. So if you want to deploy a chatbot, a public-facing LLM in China, you have to go through an approval process. You need a license with a standardized, structured test, and it's partly about what you might expect, censorship and control of what information is generated, but it's also about things like accuracy. In a way that is a lot more coherent and structured than what we have today in the West. So China, I think, is also worth looking at. All right, so last bit is what's changing with Trump. Everything and nothing. Potentially a big change in rhetoric. So instead of a focus on risk management, which has really been the focus of the Biden administration, the Trump people, and this was not an issue that you saw any campaign ads about, but it was a big issue for very influential donors and participants in the Trump campaign, including Elon Musk. They want to unshackle AI. They think the potential is there for this technology to be many orders of magnitude better, more powerful, more valuable for the economy and for America. And they think regulation is standing in the way. So that's their orientation. But the problem is how you actually do that. These issues still come up. And companies are voluntarily doing this AI governance, engaging in these standards processes because they want the AI to be trusted. They don't want to have a situation where they build something and it's discriminatory or one of their users commits suicide. So I think in practice there will be less difference than you think. But yeah, in terms of the overall orientation, the shift is going to be significant in terms of what you hear. And the analogy that I think of is, if I asked you, what's the most innovative and advanced car company, you'd probably say Tesla. And then if I asked you, what car brand has the highest rate of fatalities? In other words, if you want to maximize the chance you or someone else is going to get killed by your car, what car should you buy? Tesla, number one. And that's, I think, the kind of approach that we are going to see under the Trump administration. And it's a balancing act. And again, companies want to be responsible. We're going to see this real push full speed ahead.
And if I can add a quick note to what Kevin just said, I loved all these different countries and the differences you talked about. I think one I would add there is Singapore that I find very interesting. And Singapore has a model AI governance framework. They recently came up with a governance framework for generative AI specifically. It tends to be a bit more business friendly. Obviously, Singapore is a big economic zone, and so they've taken a lot of care. But that's an interesting one to look at. And then we talked about countries and federal level. There are state-based differences. And so I think as far as states go, one of the interesting ones in the US is California. And California was early to come up with the bill SB 1047, which eventually didn't pass, but that had lots of very interesting and debatable things, which we might talk about later. Yeah. But then there are state-based differences as well.
No, absolutely. There are 700 pending AI bills in U.S. states and dozens that have been adopted, including California, Colorado, many other states. So yeah, that's actually something that probably in response to the Trump administration at the federal level pulling back in some areas, we'll see states be more aggressive.
That's good. In the U.S., you always have this, back and forth between different levels of policy at the state level and the federal level, and you'll see this play out in AI like you see it in every other field.
Yeah, the big debate in Congress is going to be preemption, is going to be, do we override these state bills given that it's a more deregulatory Republican Congress now? So look for that debate.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, next question, we're going to Kartik again. And the discussions around AI have also a bit of a technical component because it's a very complex technological space, evolving still rapidly, large amounts of investment being made in the private sector. And so I think when it comes to regulation, it's also important to understand what is possible and what is feasible. So to what extent do you think that issues like, say, bias or hallucination or accuracy or explainability, which is also very important for policy purposes, these are basically technical problems, or are they ethical problems, or are they legal? To what extent, what the boundary here between the technical and the, let's say, the governance or policy discussion?
Yeah, look, I think they're all of these. There are technical problems, there are legal problems, there are ethical problems. I mean, you talked about bias, let's pick bias. So if I look at bias, where are bias in AI models coming from? Usually from the training data. And so there are technical mitigation measures. So if you look at what's the technology lens to the bias problem, it is thinking about, first, do you have bias detection tools that you're using? Are you looking at things like data resampling to look at the fact that certain data are missing or dominated by other data? Say for minority groups, their data is actually sparse. And so are you resampling that? Are you using fairness-aware machine learning approaches to do that? So it's all, there are a lot of technical answers to this question. And then, yes, it's a legal issue too. For example, if I use these algorithms in settings like hiring or credit scoring, as Kevin was saying, there are existing laws like anti-discrimination laws that you have to be compliant with. And so if an AI system is being used for hiring and it violates an anti-discrimination law, then there are legal consequences of it. And so one has to engage with the legal side of those issues as well. And again, bias is an ethical issue too, because when you get into questions around fairness, then you get into what is fairness? Who gets to define fairness? Is fairness equality of outcomes, or is fairness equality of opportunities? And so then a lot of these get into those ethical debates about how do we define this before you can go tell a computer scientist, fix fairness, you have to go and tell the computer scientist what is fairness.
Right.
So it's all of these issues.
And I think in a way, adding maybe to your discussion of the technical, discussion, to me, bias is actually a particularly interesting one, because there is certainly a lot of technical solution to bias. And I think the issue with the training data, for example, it's often hard to solve, but well understood as a technical problem. But I think the difficulty emerges when you deploy algorithms into social systems and you have bias emerging as an interplay between algorithmic and human decision-making. These might be very difficult to foresee a priori. You only see when this happens. It's very hard to, only from an engineering point of view, make sure that these things don't happen.
Right. One quick thing I want to say on that is, there's the media talks so much about AI biases, and the issues are real. But I tend to be less of the doomsday predictor, because the way I look at it, okay, you're worried about AI biases. The question is, what's the alternative? The alternative is human decision makers who are incredibly biased, but more importantly, they can hide their biases behind explanations that seem to make sense. It's harder to hide AI biases. The problem with AI biases is that they scale. A biased judge in a courtroom affects a few thousand lives. If you use an AI system to guide a judge's sentencing decisions and it is biased, it affects millions of lives. So yes, AI biases are an issue, mainly because of their scale, but there are also issues that can be caught and corrected and fixed at scale, which is much harder to do with human biases.
I like this idea of, think about what is the alternative, right? It's not like we don't live in a perfect world.
Exactly.
Well, and to your point, the two things come together, where you've got human decision makers who are interacting with the AI, either deferring to the AI or not, or using it. No, this goes back to our discussion earlier about regulation and how to balance it. If the rules say no bias, that's just not technically possible for all these reasons. On the other hand, if the rules say you need to take some reasonable care, you need to take some steps, and again, there's evolution of standards and best practices about what the technical toolkit looks like, what the ethical toolkit looks like, what the governance toolkit looks like, then we're getting somewhere where we can have some confidence that the real bad things won't happen and we'll get the benefits of the AI.
Yeah, at least minimize the chances of that happening. Let's go to a different question. I'll ask that to Kevin. How do you think AI regulation relates to broader questions around technology regulation? AI being one area, but clearly interfacing with a lot of other areas. And so, for example, privacy concerns about social media platforms or controversies around TikTok. So here, the role of general tech regulation and AI.
Yeah, we've had this big debate for more than a decade now about big tech and tech platforms. At some level, all tech regulation is AI regulation now, because all tech companies are AI companies. You look at the issues about, for example, our social media platforms using their recommendation engines unfairly in some way. Well, that's the question about, these are machine learning algorithms. These are AI technologies. Is TikTok, through its algorithms, providing certain content and promoting certain content that's harmful? That's the basis of a major lawsuit that's going forward against TikTok. Is TikTok a platform that's being used by China in ways that's harmful to the US? That's the basis for the law that would require TikTok to divest. All that's about algorithms. All that's about AI. So at some level, all this comes together. This, though, I think is going to be an interesting tension point, to get back to your prior question, in the Trump administration. Because on the one hand, you have this top-line desire to take the shackles off, let companies do whatever they want, not have regulation get in the way of companies investing massively and deploying massively in AI. On the other hand, you have this thread in the new administration about, we want to go after big tech, both for antitrust reasons and the perception that many of these companies are biased against conservatives. That's going to be a tension. You see it with TikTok, where first Trump administration, Trump wanted to ban TikTok, and now during the campaign he said he thought it should be allowed to continue, even though a law has been passed requiring divestment. So I don't know exactly how that's going to come out, but you're going to see both of those threads being really in tension.
Great, thank you. Now we are basically at the halfway mark, so it's time now to opening up to questions from the audience. So please, keep making those questions. I have a few questions already, so I'm going to ask those, and I propose that I'm just going to ask the question, then you jump in and we take it from there. Now, this is a question from LinkedIn. Can you deepen a little bit on AI recommendation systems and how they should be regulated to comply with accuracy and reliability? Who wants to take that?
I can start on that. I mean, I think it's really the issue the answer I gave before. You can't have precise requirements, and accuracy is a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge for all AI, especially things like robustness. The data changes, systems become sometimes inaccurate. But we have this issue of hallucinations or confabulations with generative AI, which is just a fundamentally hard problem. They're generative systems. They're systems that have some degree of randomness involved and are creating new things where they don't understand in any kind of human way how they relate to the real world. So you can't have a requirement that says we're just going to pick some threshold arbitrarily and it's got to be below that. Again, I think what we need is a set of rules that tell companies take reasonable care. This is a well-established standard under the law, in tort law, and in many other laws. It was actually a piece of the California SB 1047 bill that Kartik talked about that was vetoed before it went into effect. But it doesn't tell companies exactly what to do. It says you need to have a process, you need to have a structure, you need to disclose what you're doing. Ultimately, they're going to be standards, so you can see if what you're doing is what is considered appropriate within the industry. So this is an ongoing process. I think that's where we're going to go. The one exception is the first thing I mentioned at the beginning, which is AI safety. So if what we're worried about is catastrophic harm, then we need to at least have some arbitrary threshold. It's going to be highly imperfect, but some threshold to say if this is a system with the following capabilities, we need to really ensure that we mitigate these very, very severe risks. And again, we'll pick a number that's technically not right and it's going to change. But again, given how big the threat is on the other side, that's where we may need to be more precise.
That's actually in line also with the European regulation where this traffic light system, where there is a red category, which we should be kind of worried about.
Well, the red category is about unacceptable uses. So those are things that the European Union thinks just should not be deployed. So emotion detection in schools and the workplace, which is something that's not prohibited in the US, and there's reasons to think that there might be valuable uses. They've said that's impermissible. Large-scale real-time biometric scanning, impermissible in the European Union. So that's the red light. But you're right, they do have a provision in the AI Act that's similar to what the Biden executive order did for these advanced foundation models. At a certain threshold, they have to provide additional data and additional requirements.
So while I agree with Kevin about you can't have 100% accuracy, and therefore the focus is around what measures have you taken, there are other governance frameworks that can be layered on top of the fact that you don't have 100% accuracy, and it's required in some settings. So for example, explanations is one of those. So you have a system that's not 100% accurate, but can AI recommendations come with explanations? So if you're saying, reject this loan applications, does it come with an explanation for why? And so there's a lot of work. It's a technical solution around ML interpretability and coming up with explanations for black box systems. You have human in the loop requirements as well. So for certain settings where you have AI making recommendations or it cannot be fully autonomous, you have to have a human in the loop so you can detect those systems. So I think you can layer some of those governance mechanisms on top of AI systems that are not 100% accurate.
Yeah, and that probably would be a matter of navigating the regulatory environment and companies experimenting what are the best ways to meet these criteria that are laid out in regulation. Now, the next question I think is interesting because it highlights just the broad range of topics that AI regulation might bring into view and just how interconnected this is with a lot of other things in society and the economy. So here's a question. With 3 Mile and Chernobyl energy demands to power usage, what are the long-term energy issues that Congress will have to address that will affect policy? How does this connect to energy policy?
Yeah, well, so AI systems, especially these massive general purpose, large language models, generative systems require massive amounts of energy to train and also a significant amount at the inference stage. And so if you want to build one of these flagship foundation models, something like what OpenAI and Google and Anthropic are doing, already we're in the hundreds of millions of dollars to $1 billion to train these models, and potentially, if the scaling laws hold, which is an open technical question, then we might be up to $10, $100 billion to train one model. Microsoft has already done a deal to restart one of the reactors at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant here in Pennsylvania. They're going to pay $1.6 billion just to turn it back on. It was shut off, not the one that melted down in the 70s. It was shut off because it just wasn't economically viable. $1.5 billion to turn it on, and Microsoft is guaranteed $800 million a year for 20 years that they're paying for electricity, all for data centers, almost all basically for AI for one company. So yes, the demand is extraordinary. This does fit in the new administration to a broad desire to, just as I talked about AI, full speed ahead with energy, every method possible to get more energy generation in the US. The positive potential side is this will really put pressure for innovation. So Microsoft's turning back on 3 Mile Island, but Google and Amazon have placed orders with next generation small modular nuclear companies. There are companies that have orders of magnitude better technology for nuclear reactors than anything that's been deployed. And AI might be what pushes to get that out in the marketplace. Now, obviously, there are downsides with nuclear power and any kind of energy. But I think that's going to be the pressure. In other places, though, where there's scarcity, it's going to put pressure technically to come up with models that don't require all that cost and training. It's sort of similar to what's happening in China with the restrictions on advanced GPUs because of US sanctions. They're trying to innovate around building models that work well without that same expense on the compute side. So I think we'll see different solutions in different places.
Let me put some numbers to what Kevin was saying. So in most states in the US today, data centers consume about 10% of the energy in those states. In states like Virginia, which is close to DC, 25% of energy consumption is data centers. So it's massive. And in fact, data centers is roughly 3 New York Cities worth of energy right now. But it's projected in just the next 4 years, it'll be another 3 New York Cities worth of energy. So that's the kind of energy demand supply imbalance that we have to solve for. It's not surprising that Microsoft invests in nuclear energy to turn this plant that was not operational back on. Sam Altman has made an investment in a nuclear energy kind of company. Many of these things are going to happen. At the end of the day, I think regulators will have to think about energy security. How much can AI pull? Pricing implications for consumers. I think one of the nice things for those people who are listening, who are innovators, entrepreneurs, is this is going to be a great area of entrepreneurial activity, innovation, and venture investments. Because it's going to be a problem that's going to grow bigger and bigger. And it's not just how do you create energy, but it's also around how do you make AI systems more efficient? Can you have better architectures for neural networks, better architectures for processors besides GPUs, so that can solve these kinds of energy problems?
Yeah, and I mean, this is, like you say, 3 new New York cities. This is not like a substitution of, say, gas-powered cars to electric-powered cars. This is a new energy demand on top of everything else. Okay, so a different question. How can regulation of AI impact collaboration or competition between firms? So there's an interesting interplay between, the regulators setting rules of the game and how that is going to affect competitive and collaborative patterns in industry. What do you have any thoughts on that?
I can talk a little bit about some collaborative patterns. And Kevin, maybe you can talk about some of the competitive patterns. Well, on the collaborative patterns, I think if you look at what companies can do over here, AI presents obviously a big opportunity, but it's also reputational, litigation, and regulatory risk for companies. If you don't self-regulate, you don't take governance seriously, then when things go wrong, it's going to be in the news, like where Air Canada chatbot, it's in the news that their system made false assurances. It led to a lawsuit. And eventually, there'll be a regulation as well. So one of the big things companies can collaborate on is to come together as industries and figure out what can we do, what are the standards that we can agree on, what can we do so that we can ensure that there are best practices that are shared, so that we avoid the big hand of government regulation coming in by showing that we can self-govern. So an example of that is the partnership on AI, where many tech companies have come together, created the partnership of AI. They've brought in a bunch of nonprofits like ACLU into the board over there to collaboratively figure out how we are going to govern our AI implementations. So I think that's where there's a role for collaboration. My fear, though, is that they often send their scientists and researchers into these partnerships who are doing all the right things, but those researchers don't necessarily have executive decision making. And when push comes to shove, when the big decisions have to be made, when the tough decisions have to be made, do they have enough clout and influence? I don't know. So the fear is these things like partnership on AI could just be smoke and mirrors. And I'm hoping it's not, but that's the fear I have.
Yeah, I talked to a lot of companies, and especially not just the big foundation labs that are building the AI, but all the large enterprises in the world that are either deploying or looking very heavily at deploying AI. And they all say, what's the other guy doing? Because most of them say, okay, we know we may not be at the front of the line. We may not be the company that has the best AI governance system in our industry or overall. But we don't want to be the worst. We want to, figure out again what's the norm, what's the expectation, what are the best practices, and there are a number of private organizations like Partnership on AI, a number of groups that are doing some of that coordination, but not nearly enough. Companies don't really understand and have a sense of what industry you're doing. I think that's a role for places like Wharton, where because we can talk to everyone and we're not competing with them, we can help provide some of that information. But there's a real need and a real demand for it. I think that the competitive dimension goes back to what I was talking about before, this question about regulation. If there is not ultimately a regulatory backstop, if basically companies are encouraged or they do have self-interest in wanting to take appropriate steps, but nothing is going to happen if you are the company that made no effort to ensure your systems were accurate and fair and transparent and not being abused for all of these harmful uses, then that's going to create a dynamic of a race to the bottom. It's going to create a situation where you will have a few companies that just say, screw it, we're going to try and grow as fast as we can and ignore these very real problems. And the responsible companies may be forced to cut down what they are doing because they've got to compete. Why are you going so much more slowly, the board is going to say, than this other company over there? So I think we want to have a race to the top, but that's a point where regulation is important in saying, here's some baselines. And that is something that no one should be able to do, to go below them. But then what you do above them, that ultimately will come to some consensus in the industry.
Yeah, and I think one approach, of course, companies will take action because they're afraid of regulation. They want to prevent too heavy hand by showing that they are taking care. Another way in which companies might react is by having a direct influence on regulation by trying to lobby for it. And so there is a question about that. So I'm going to move to that one. That's a LinkedIn question. How can we stop regulatory capture by big tech companies? The players who pose a danger in critical sectors are ones who have the power to train large systems, and they move closer to the corridors of power. Any idea there about that?
Well, I guess I'll go first. I would say, it's not just an AI challenge or a tech challenge. It's a big challenge in general. Regulatory capture is a big concern. That being said, first of all, you hear a lot of a sense that, at least in some quarters, what we've seen on AI regulation to date is just regulatory capture, is companies saying, I want to build a moat against everyone else that might compete with me. And while there's some of that, I think that's not entirely fair. I think companies are trying to figure this out. This is a new area. We don't know what the technology is going to do. We don't know what the appropriate rules are. And companies, I think, are recognizing that we need to start somewhere. What I'll say, though, on the question of regulatory capture is, this is not just an issue where you've got big companies and little individuals. You've got a lot of big companies. Again, remember, we're talking here pretty much every company. And it's not just the big tech companies. I mean, all of the big financial services companies. JP Morgan's got a $10 billion a year IT budget. We don't think of it as a tech company. They have a lot to say and a lot of interest in where this goes. And yes, they're not not entirely on the side of just individual users, but their interests are not the same as Google's interests or Amazon's interest or Microsoft's interest. And then you multiply that all the way across. So yes, we need better policies. We need a better politics. We need better regulatory structures that don't get captured. But I think here it's going to be more complex. Even among the policymakers, as I said, we've got different tensions between the people who want to beat up on big tech versus the people who want to enable big tech. So I'm hopeful there'll be some kind of balance ultimately in that way.
And
I think open source adds an interesting dimension to this question about regulatory implications, regulatory capture, and so on. In a world where you have huge entry barriers, $100 million to train a model, need access to massive data sets, need distribution in terms of bringing the models to the consumers, it's clearly very hard for the small guy to compete. But I think open source could be an interesting answer where we have seen, for example, in the world of operating systems, when it was looking like Microsoft was going to dominate, Linux came in and offered another opportunity, another option to companies. And we've seen time and again, open source, it's basically the whole community comes together and creates an option. And open source could be an interesting option there. You, of course, have models like Meta's Llama, Falcon, and Mistral, and many others that are, I wouldn't call them open source. They're open parameter models that share more than the completely closed models. But they're not truly open source. But open source, again, it's not a panacea. It's not a cure-all, because open source creates some interesting opportunities where there is a model that's accessible to anyone else who can understand the model and build off of it. But open source also creates regulatory challenges because with closed source, you can go after the 3-4 companies that are deploying the models, and you can subject them to a lot of regulation. With open source, it's hard to go after anyone. You don't know who's using it for what. There's no disclosure. It's very hard to regulate that. So I think open source is helpful, perhaps in the concentration of power among a few companies, but then could also create new regulatory problems.
And hopefully also put some pressure on the more closed system to be a little bit more transparent about the training data and what the algorithms are doing. Okay, so here, next question. How do you see liability for AI-caused harm evolving from here? When AI causes harm, will regulation shelter the AI creator from liability? Will the click license need to be revisited? How do you think that this idea of liability is going to evolve?
Yeah. You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll keep it brief. I think there are 2 aspects to the liability. The first is the underlying foundation model that is powering applications. And then there are applications that leverage the foundation models to do things. I think in a lot of instances, in my opinion, the liability will lie with the applications that are doing things with it. It's hard to hold the foundation models liable for the end applications doing things on top of the foundation models. They would be liable for not doing certain things like safety checks, not doing certain things like when an issue comes up, shutting down those applications. And again, we talked about the California bill. The California bill had proposals where they were holding these large foundation models liable, but it was not liability in the sense that you have to provide guarantees that these things won't happen, and if they happen, we hold you liable. But it is liability along the lines of, did you put in those governance frameworks? Did you have the tests? Did you, for example, report safety issues when they occurred? Did you take action by bringing down those applications? So that's how I think about liability in this context.
Yeah, it's important to understand liability is not the same thing as regulation. Right? Regulation is a government administrative agency says, here are these requirements, and if you fail to meet them, we will take some enforcement action against you. Liability is someone's going to sue you. And that is a very, very powerful tool. So I mentioned earlier this Illinois biometric privacy law passed in 2008. No one really thought it was very important, but it has a private right of action. It says if you take biometric information without people's consent, they can sue you individually or in a class action. This is the most significant AI law ever passed in terms of actually influencing companies. It got Facebook not only to pay a $500 million settlement, but to shut down its photo tagging technology because they were so concerned about that liability. That means it's a dangerous club. It can be too powerful if you get too much set of lawsuit that then prevents companies from innovating. But I think we need to look at the structure of liability in this area. And it's not just an AI issue. We've had this for a long time for software. If you're using a Windows PC and there's a bug in Windows that costs your company $1 billion because some calculation in Excel just comes out wrong because of a bug in Microsoft's programming, you get nothing because your license for Windows basically says you get nothing, and we allow that to just be a contractual disclaimer. And there's some concerns about technically whether software is subject to what's called products liability. This is an area that has been opened up for debate. So Europe actually, in parallel to the AI Act, has a law called the Products Liability Directive that's now adopted, and something called the AI Liability Directive they're looking at. I think we need to look at this more in the US about the potential for creating the contours of that private liability, that it provides the appropriate incentives. So that companies need to look not just at regulators, because regulators can be captured and regulators can just say, okay, here's a fine that a company is willing to pay. The threat of private liability may be the thing that actually creates sufficient incentives to address these concerns.
Thank you. I think that's actually very interesting to see how some of these cases, for example, you were talking about companion AI apps. I think that would be a case where probably most of the pressure on the companies are going to come from basically private litigation kind of worries, I would say.
Yeah, if there's not regulation, that's the only alternative. The problem is it's difficult to find a viable legal theory. There is a lawsuit filed by the parents of a kid who killed himself using character AI. But it is challenging under existing law for a whole bunch of reasons.
Okay, Kevin, earlier you mentioned this like a race to the top, and I think I like this idea of having a positive spin on how regulation can actually be designed to support improvements in the way the companies think about these things. So speaking of a race to the top, do you see a world where policies can provide incentives and subsidies to achieve greater governance? What is the positive side rather than the stick? Do we have a carrot?
Oh, absolutely. And there's going to be a lot of carrots as well in AI policy here and elsewhere. There already are in terms of direct government funding and incentives and public compute and education, immigration. There was a lot actually in that Biden executive order that was really not at all about regulation. It was about encouraging and facilitating and supporting AI in the US. And the Trump administration is going to really double down on all of that. I think for a regulatory standpoint, it's a mechanism design problem. It's really recognizing that there are sometimes perverse incentives, and that anytime you create a measure and say you get some benefit if you do the following, companies are going to game that. That's just naturally how people and companies behave. But if you understand that's going to happen, thinking about how do we create something that sets up the incentives so that self-interest is actually of collective benefit. And I think a lot of that is getting companies to coordinate, removing concerns and encouraging them to do that, interaction, standard setting, that dialogue, where that actually benefits them, as opposed to being concerned that if they don't meet some requirement or they give up some information, they'll be in trouble. And then again, I think coming up with a standard that says at least there is some threshold of reasonableness and best practices, that if you at least do that, you get some regulatory benefit. That's not quite the race to the top, but at least it aligns everyone's incentives in a positive direction.
Right. Yeah. And Kartik, you've been involved in tech ventures, and you're close to, let's say, Silicon Valley kind of networks. Do you see some of this carrot side too? What's your impression?
Well, I would say the carrot side, I mean, to be honest, for the most part, I would say right now where we are is that it's a land grab kind of world where there's lots of new potential use cases of AI. You want to go in, be first to market, brand yourself, raise the money on your early traction. So not many are worried about or thinking about what can go wrong, what are the governance issues. No VC is spending too much time thinking about it. No entrepreneur is spending too much time. And that's the reality of it. The two, I think, areas where I think there is something here is, one is, as Kevin was saying, sometimes there's money for you if you go and comply with things. Like there are grants and incentives of various sort. The Biden administration offered a few. Singapore government has also offered a few where if you follow their model AI governance framework and you do a bunch of things, they give you credits and things like that, right? So tax credits and other kinds of things. So it helps for sure. Sometimes it happens because it gives you a competitive advantage. So if you look at Perplexity, their innovation in search was solving a transparency problem, where they came out with, you ask a question, they give you an answer, and they give you citations. And so you have provenance, you can go back, look at the source. And it's not because they want to do good, it's because that gives them that competitive advantage. And at times it does that, so you do it for strategic reasons. Sometimes, like in finance, you see companies that are building neural nets for credit scoring, but they're not going to roll it out right away because I guess regulation requires explanations and things like that. But for the most part, I would say don't expect Silicon Valley to be the place that is going to take a governance first approach. I think the government incentives help, and which is why ultimately I feel they're, sitting in a business school, not in legal studies, but sitting in a technology sort of group, I still feel that that regulation has a big role.
Yeah, it's interesting. One area where there's a whole bunch of entrepreneurs that have gone after is, let's build a governance solution. Let's build technologies and systems that we can sell to companies. And they're finding exactly what you're finding. There's lots and lots of companies with good AI governance technology out there that are struggling to get traction in the marketplace because they're early in terms of that demand.
And I like the diplomatic answer of don't expect the tech sector necessarily to be the ones looking for more governance, of course.
Yeah. It is the truth. By the way, when I wrote a book, it's called A Human's Guide to Machine Intelligence, in which I proposed an AI Bill of Rights in 2018. And soon after the book, I decided I'm going to start a company that's going to do AI governance solution. And I spent 6 months roughly building out pieces of that. And then I went to the market and I realized, I am way too early and nobody is going to do this unless there's regulation that says you have to do it. And that's why I didn't work on that venture. But I think that's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah. I love the thought leadership. All right, so we're coming towards the end, but there's time, I think, for at least one question. And here's a question about maybe a bit more specific technology, but I think one, especially coming through the election cycle, especially here, I think in Pennsylvania, where we're bombarded by messages. How do we better prepare for managing misinformation amplified exponentially in the age of AI? How do you think we can think about regulation as a vehicle to help creating an information environment where individuals can make good decisions?
Yeah, we're looking at each other. It's such a hard problem, and partly why it's a hard problem are things that are not about AI. Yeah. There's been a lot of research into election misinformation coming into this election and other elections this year, UK, India, and so forth. And most of the research has suggested wasn't as bad as people feared. There does not seem to be evidence that deepfakes and other misinformation dramatically shifted people's votes because of false information. The downside is why. And the reason why is nobody trusts anything anymore because they no longer have faith in institutions. They don't believe that real information is real. So therefore, they're not necessarily swayed by something that's a deepfake. That's a big societal problem. There are pieces of this we can tackle. There have been a number of bills, some of the California bills that were adopted tackle this, and I think we'll probably see federal legislation that just make it clear that deliberate false information is prohibited in elections. And there have been cases. The Federal Communications Commission sanctioned the phone company that passed on fake robocalls of Joe Biden's voice back during the primaries. It's not going to solve the problem, but there's going to be more pushback and more mechanisms. And then there are some technical means about watermarking and so forth, the standards going on. They're not perfect, but I think it will be more possible if you want to verify the accuracy of information. And then we just have to rely on the kind of dynamic that Kartik talked about with Perplexity. If there is value in the market in saying we are going to provide accurate information and provenance of the information, then there will be ways to do it. But that's really the big challenge, and it's something I worry about in the US, whether that pressure will be there.
My 30-second answer to it would be education. I would require, if it were in my hands, every school to have an AI literacy program in middle school and high school. I would, in fact, require every student to create deepfakes. I would probably want every person on earth to spend a lot of time creating lots of deepfakes. Once you do it a few times, you start to realize what this is about, and you start to realize everything I see has to be questioned. And so, yeah, I think for me, it's education.
This could be a deep fake right now. If you're watching, you don't know if we're actually.
If you're on LinkedIn, this could be a deep fake. The people in front of us, you can touch us and confirm we're real.
Yeah, I love this idea of, in the end, it's about preparing for this and making, I think as an education institution, I cannot but agree with the point that education is going to be the answer. Now we're coming to the end of the hour together. I think it was incredibly insightful to listen to you two talking about regulation. Thank you very much for doing this. And we're going to wrap up now. The next event is going to be a real estate interest rates and the shifting American dream, which will take place on December 4. I'm sure that will be great. Thank you all.
Thank you, Stefano.